An important aspect of the regulatory process in California is the distinction between regular rulemaking and emergency rulemaking. So these are some of the key considerations in emergency rulemaking here in California. A state agency needs to provide notice of an emergency regulation that the agency is proposing, and this must occur at least 5 working days before submitting an emergency regulation to the Office of Administrative Law, OAL. The adopting agency is generally required to send a notice of the proposed emergency action, including certain information, to every person who has filed a request for notice of regulatory action with that agency. Now, a regulation may be adopted as an emergency regulation if a state agency makes a finding that the adoption of the regulation or the order of repeal is necessary to address an emergency in this state. A state agency must make a finding of an emergency that includes a written statement containing certain specified information that you can find in the government code in the APA section, as well as a description of the specific facts demonstrating the existence of the emergency and the need for immediate regulatory action. In addition, the finding must demonstrate by substantial evidence that there's a need for the proposed regulation to effectuate the statute. Now, note that a finding of an emergency based only upon expediency, convenience, best interest, general public need, or speculation are not adequate grounds to demonstrate by substantial evidence the existence of an emergency. Now, an emergency regulation will remain in effect no more than 180 days, but OAL may approve, not more than twice, readoptions, each for a period not to exceed 90 days, or roughly 1 year. However, that readoption for 1 or 2 additional 90-day periods is only permitted if the agency has made substantial progress and proceeded with diligence to comply with specified statutory requirements. Now, there are a couple of provisions in the CCR, the California Code of Regulations, also to note here. In 1 CCR section 48, titled Notice of Proposed Emergency Action, that provides that unless the emergency situation clearly poses an immediate serious harm, that delaying action to allow public comment would be inconsistent with the public interest, then a specified notice must contain a required statement. Secondly, in 1 CCR section 50, and it's titled Special Requirements for Submission of Emergency Regulatory Action. This regulation provides that for all emergency regulatory actions promulgated, that the agency must prepare specified documentation, submit copies of all documents, such as findings of the emergency, as well as an estimate of the fiscal impact of the proposed regulatory action. Also, the agency's statement under 1 CCR section 50 is required to confirm that the emergency situation addressed by the regulation clearly poses such an immediate serious harm that delaying action to allow notice and public comment would be inconsistent with the public interest. The statement also has to include specific facts demonstrating by substantial evidence that failure of the rulemaking agency to adopt the regulation within the time periods required for notice will likely result in serious harm to the public peace, health, safety, or general welfare. In 1 CCR section 52, that section of the California Code of Regulations is titled Readoption of Emergency Regulations. And this section provides that readoption of an emergency regulation requires sending a notice of the proposed regulatory action, along with a statement providing specific facts that demonstrate by substantial evidence that the agency has made substantial progress and has proceeded with diligence. Also, that the emergency circumstances are unchanged since the initial adoption or the prior readoption was done. In 1 CCR section 55, that's titled OAL Review of Public Comments. This section of the CCR provides that OAL may consider comments submitted directly to them by the public in connection with emergency regulation review. However, OAL cannot review comments submitted directly to OAL by the public when the OAL is reviewing regular rulemaking, that is non-emergency. So comments can only be submitted directly to OAL for emergency rulemaking actions, but not for regular ones. Also in section 55, in order for OAL to review comments submitted directly to them on an emergency rulemaking, those comments must be submitted to OAL in writing and received by OAL within 5 calendar days after the notice of the filing of the proposed emergency regulation is posted by OAL on its internet website. The public must simultaneously submit their comments to OAL and the adopting agency. And then OAL is required to consider rulemaking agency rebuttals or responses to those comments concerning the emergency regulations if they're submitted to OAL in writing and are received by OAL within 8 calendar days after the receipt of the regulations. Then finally, there's 1 CCR section 56 titled Emergency Regulations Adopted After Completion of Rulemaking Procedures. This section of the California Code of Regulations provides that when a regulation adopted as an emergency is submitted to OAL with the certificate of compliance and the entire rulemaking file, then OAL is required to review the emergency statement within 10 days and not file the regulation if OAL determines that the statement fails to satisfy the requirements of the APA. Finally, OAL must review the emergency regulation and rulemaking file within 30 days and order repeal of the regulation if OAL determines that the regulation fails to meet the standards of an emergency regulation, or if OAL determines that the regulation fails to comply with provisions of the state APA.